Good evening. So today we are discussing about IBM DataPower Gateway. So I'll be explaining a couple of concepts which we are discussing on the IBM DataPower Gateway as part of IBM's product. So this IBM DataPower Gateway, we know it's one of the IBM product as part of IBM middleware integration technology and IBM standards. So and just talk about myself on few words. So I have total 12 years of experience in the integration platform, and I have experience in dealing with IBM App Connect Professional, you formerly called as IBM Caster, IBM DataPower, and IBM API Connect. So I work as an administrator and a DataPower developer professional. So and I have around 5 years of training experience on delivering the training on IBM DataPower products. So today I'm gonna talk about few things which we're gonna discuss as part of this demo, like integration architecture. So what is integration architecture like EA and ESB and SOA? So most of the IBM middleware products will comes under like enterprise architecture integration platform, and it comes under enterprise service bus layer. So where we have all the components are involved in terms of the middleware. So what are the things required in terms of the middleware SOA components? Those will be available in all the IBM products. So, but we have DataPower has some specifications and it has some significance when compared to other products. So I'll explain that. And this project product also runs on a SOA component, SOA architecture, and it's a service-oriented architecture. And these are all the independent components. It's not a tightly coupled; it's a very loosely coupled as part of the traditional integration projects and traditional integration mechanism. So, in terms of IBM DataPower Gateway history and introduction, so initially this DataPower Gateway it was called as a former name called XML appliance, like XML Gateway. So mostly it's based on XML and XSLT configurations. So initially it was just used to process your XML messages for a wide speed of transactions and a high availability of your network in the different zones. So later on, IBM has upgraded the features and the security capabilities, and they have changed the particular XML accelerator XML interface to the IBM DataPower. IBM DataPower integration appliance. So there were a lot of uh, past uh, past applications and past components appliances were available. So the latest one we call it as IBM DataPower integration tool, and later the latest one which IBM renamed it completely as a gateway, IBM DataPower Gateway. So on top of that, IBM will be releasing different number of versions, different number of firmware versions in terms of security capabilities, in terms of performance enhancements. Okay. So, and third point, why we need data power. So there are different number of tools available in the product. So what IBM data power will do, those will also do. And even any other ESB tools, what the capabilities or what are the performance features of those tools, data power will do that. But it has some significant components in terms of security. So this act as a gateway in any of the network applications. Like this will act as a security gateway in the demilitarized zone, where there may be a chances of attacks and threats to your network protocols or network messages. So DataPower has a strong capabilities of security when compared to other products. So that's the main concern of the data agenda of the data power, and it has a wide speed of transactions so that the enterprise organizations, enterprise levels, they constantly say the high availability of the network and high availability of their applications to the different number of end users or consumers. And when it comes to data power features and capabilities, it's again features like any other ESB tool. It will perform all the transformations and it can do the routing mechanisms, whatever it is expecting from the consumer point of view or a service providers. And it can provide different security mechanisms to the services which are onboarded in a data power. And also it can provide terms of authentication or authorization in terms of the service consumers, and it has very strong capabilities in terms of message level security and network level security. So and also strong capabilities in terms of a logging, in terms of the transactions speed. There is a very less latency in the data port transactions when you compare with any other products. So there are a lot of development activities which we're going to learn as part of this training. like there is so there is a lot of actions which are available in the IBM DataPower product for users to implement their business logic in terms of XSLT configurations and in JavaScript configurations. So in DataPower terminology, you call it as a gateway script. So where we can perform all the routing logic and transformational logics within those components. In terms of this development, you can implement a security implementations like providing a security to the services which are onboarded on a data port, and you can provide security to the consumers whoever is consuming it, and different number of service providers. So in terms of security, you can use in different protocols like SAML integrations or secure socket layer integrations. So this all can be done. And even authentication authorization mechanism, you can integrate with different target systems in terms of LDAP for user authentication, and IBM Security Access Manager is a different system where you can directly integrate to that. So in terms of authentication or authorization, and also DataPower has the capabilities to generate your OAuth tokens or SAML tokens or JSON web tokens depending on the service provider's requirement. So DataPower has that feasibility inbuilt. And there are a lot of services in the DataPower, like we DataPower can expose its services as a REST service to the consumer. Also, it can expose it as a web services to the consumer. A similar note, DataPower can consume different services in terms of a REST and in terms of a web services. So with respect to their components, whatever the dependent component in terms of that, we can implement a service in the DataPower, whether it's a SOAP or REST, depending on the service consumers and providers. Like even DataPower act as a service provider for OAuth token generator. Similar way for a JSON web token. DataPower acts as a service provider to generate OAuth token and JSON web tokens to the different consumers. And also a single sign-on can be possible in the DataPower. It's depending on the consumers whoever is trying to access it. And in terms of security and routing, so DataPower can act as is a DataPower security gateway in terms of demilitarized zone for the external network and acts as a gateway within the internal network. So there may be a different number of consumers for any organization. So the consumers may be internal or from the external. So if the consumer, if the organization is holding the DataPower gateway appliance, so they can set it up in the demilitarized zone where we call it as a traffic is coming from the external systems or external network. So this demilitarized zone DataPower acts as a security gateway. It's just pass through the traffic to the internal network once some kind of a security constraints is validated. So, so in such case, security and routing is happening in the DataPower. So in terms of the configurations, we can use different actions which are available, or in terms of the XSLT configurations or gateway script configurations, we can use them. And administration, yes, we're going to cover a couple of scenarios in terms of administration. It includes a DataPower device setup and setting up the few default settings when you set up a new appliance or when you set up a new installation on the DataPower. And we're going to cover the DataPower firmware upgrade activities like maintenance activities in terms of administration and the data center cleanup activities. We're going to learn what are the prerequisites required to perform that activity. And of course, for any of the transformations or routings or in the loggings in the DataPower, we're gonna go with XSLT or gateway scripts. So the dependency we have. So it's not a kind of a general XSLT or a gateway JavaScript. So on XSLT and JavaScript dependency, we have seen lot of transformation routing components we're gonna cover over there. So in terms of the routing and transformation, and in terms of the security as well, we're gonna use a lot of business logic we're gonna implement in terms of XSLT and gateway script. So even the logging mechanisms also we're gonna cover inside the XSLT components. So next here is the course curriculum, which I'm gonna cover, which we're gonna cover in terms of this DataPower development and DataPower administration. So we'll be discussing introduction to DataPower and what there are different types of appliances available in the market in terms of the DataPower, like a physical appliance, a virtual appliance, and it can be on a different clouds like Docker and Kubernetes. So there are different unique features in terms of the each appliances in terms of the virtual and the physical, and there is a different significance for each of them in terms of the enterprise level organizations. So we will be checking the differences among all those appliances, whereas we are using a virtual appliance for a kind of training scenarios and training part, and physical appliance is something enterprises will hold that. Enterprise organizations will be making use of those physical appliances to make sure it's high availability over the network. And we'll see a tool overview, like what are the different components available, and to make familiar with any DataPower developer. So we'll be going through all the components which are inside the inside DataPower product, and how we can access all those components. And we'll be covering the XML firewall scenarios, which a kind of POC scenarios which is available in a DataPower. So we'll make use of those XML firewalls and XML manager and the basic use case of them. And for any IBM integration practice, we have different kind of variables for any product. So whereas DataPower has different kind of variables, so we're gonna learn them and use case and significance of different variables in terms of different business logic implementations. And similar note, there is a multi-protocol gateway component, which is one of the critical component in a DataPower product. So which can integrate with different number of protocols and different number of systems, along with the business logic as part of the processing policies, which you're going to implement in the multi-protocol gateway. Like it includes a lot of actions available in the DataPower in terms of direct actions or in terms of the advanced actions which are available, and in terms of the XSLT and the gateway script coding as well, uh, as part of this MPG, I mean multi-protocol gateway business logic. And routing and transformation mechanism we're going to cover with respect to the XML firewalls and with respect to the multi-protocol gateway. DataPower has the direct feasibility of routing and transformation. Along with that, there is a feasibility to use your XSLT and gateway script to perform the routing and transformation. We'll be saying them. And on a same note, we have a content-based routing. Depending on your incoming request, depending on your service consumer, product will take a decision, perform the decision making in the DataPower, and it will route your request to the different backends. And also web service proxy. So it's something related to the SOAP services. If you have a requirement to integrate any SOAP service in terms of a service consumer or provider, you have an inbuilt component DataPower. It's a web service proxy. It has all the feasible and inbuilt ready-made components to create a web service proxy in the DataPower and expose it to a different number of consumers. So XSLT uses with DataPower extension functions and elements. So in the XSLT, there are a lot of predefined functionalities in terms of the XSLT from the standard W3 schools organization. Along with that, if you are applying that particular XSLT or a gateway script in terms of the DataPower, there is a lot of extension functions and a lot of extension elements which are available in terms of DataPower product. So to make use of those DataPower extension functions and elements, in the XSLTs, you have to incorporate a couple of DataPower predefined packages. So we'll be learning all those extension elements and the functions which are required in terms of any development scenarios. And gateway script uses, along with the XSLTs, DataPower has the latest functionality in the gateway script. So after version 7 from the IBM DataPower Gateway, this gateway script language also introduced in the DataPower product. So we can check in what scenarios we can use this JavaScript, in what scenarios we can go with XSLTs. We're going to learn them. And in terms of a network level security, the next component comes under is SSL in DataPower. So to communicating with different target systems, to open the connections from DataPower to the different number of consumers, we're going to set up an SSL connectivity between the consumers to DataPower and DataPower to the different number of downstream backend applications. So within this SSL connectivity concept, you have to come up with some certificate and key information to set up your SSL profiles in the DataPower to make or to enable SSL connectivity to the consumers and service providers. So that way we can provide your DataPower gateway as a gateway layer in your network, whereas it will be act as a SSL server, where it can accept only the SSL or a HTTPS requests over SSL. And there is a AAA component, which is one of the most important component in DataPower after SSL in terms of authentication, authorization, and auditing of your incoming requests. So whereas you will be having different thousands of lakhs of consumers to your DataPower product to access your services. So it's difficult to maintain all of them in terms of the SSL certificates. So everyone can come with SSL, but it is difficult to maintain manage the resource identities. So DataPower has a excellent capability of authentication and authorization mechanism. So it can extract your user identities and authenticate them against different number of third-party systems. So there are different number of connectivities available in terms of the AAA component. You can connect with different number of authentication or authorization servers to perform your authentication or authorization in the DataPower. So it may be in terms of the client DNS, it may be username, password, or in terms of a SAML signatures, or in terms of the JSON web tokens, or even OAuth tokens. So these are the main security capabilities in terms of network layer components, or even in the middleware. So all these components which has direct feasibility with this component called AAA. And there is a monitoring also within the DataPower. You can monitor your incoming consumers request, like it's called as a service level monitoring. You can apply the restrictions to your consumer, and you can apply some monitoring over consumer to maintain to monitor your incoming consumer, to monitor number of requests. So that way you can reduce the overload on the backend system, irrespective of setting all the requests to the backend. Based on your business requirements, you apply that monitoring and restrictions in the ESB layer before sending it to the backend critical applications. That way, DataPower will downtime those requests based on your threshold information in the SLM actions. So there are now moving on to the next point. If you see here, processing rules and actions as part of development. So as part of any development of any service in the DataPower, in terms of a REST or a SOAP service, those are combination of your processing rule and processing action. So any MPG or WSP, it has some high level information in the component level, and the business logic should comes under this processing policy. So the processing policy contains all the business logic, and every processing policy contains a processing rules, set of rules to execute your request message, and set of rules to execute your response message, whereas exception handling also available in terms of these processing rules. And also each processing rule contains a different number of processing actions. Based on our business logic requirement, we're gonna choose the processing action, what has to be done as part of that logic. So in terms of referring to some certificates, in terms of referring to some coding components like XSLT and gateway scripts can be done via these actions. And we're going to learn how to deploy the services which you are deployed in the which you are developed in the lower environment and taking them to the higher environment. So for any service, like exporting it as some zip bundle or package before sharing it to the higher environment or deploying it to the higher environment. Similar way, we have that same feasibility. A zip package will be exported as part of the configuration, and we're going to analyze what it contains, what the folder structure, how the project structure is. And you have to, the prerequisite is definitely you have to remember few components which you need to change while moving into the higher environment. It may be the environment level information, or a service specific information might change from environment to environment. So we're going to apply some automation steps here instead of manual process. So we learn how to automate those kind of things in the DataPower. So, and error handling, logging, and troubleshooting. So there is a very extensive logging mechanism is available in DataPower. There is a default logging mechanism will be available that will comes with your DataPower product. And along with that, you can customize your logs based on the business logic, and on the customer's requirement, you can customize your logs and send it to the different target destinations. Though you can store your logs on the DataPower appliance, and even there is a feasibility to load your logs off the DataPower appliance. So you can store it somewhere on the FTP servers or any of the Unix systems, anywhere we can do in terms of offloading the DataPower device. So there is different ways of logging mechanisms, and depending on the logging level, DataPower will capture the required messages. Even you can capture logs at an entire appliance level, or even a domain level, or even for a particular event or for a particular service event itself, you can capture it log. For even for one particular consumer, you can capture logs and send it to the target systems. That way, the troubleshooting of any issue in the higher environments without capturing the high level logs, it's very easy to identify based on the log target capabilities available in DataPower. And there are a few administration activities which are required in terms of a DataPower developer. As a DataPower developer has to understand few administration concepts as well, because our product is a network level appliance based component. So where you're going to access your DataPower appliance in terms of different ways, like CLI command line interface, you can access your DataPower appliance, whereas WebGUI through the browser you can access your DataPower appliance, and through SOMA. SOMA is nothing but SOAP oriented management access. So which means from SOAP UI tool you can access your DataPower appliance, and even REST management access through Postman also you can access your DataPower appliance. So there are different ways of appliance management tools. So in terms of administration, we're going to cover a couple of components which are required as a DataPower developer. So if you are expecting something on administration concepts, some more information with respect to administration, we're going to cover them as well. In terms of setting up the device and starting from the firmware activities, and a lot of components which are required to set up in a default domain as part of administration role. So we're going to cover all those activities based on the requirement. So this is the DataPower training introduction. So duration of the course content. So whatever I discussed earlier page. So it's around 20 hours of the duration, which includes all the development activities and a high level on administration scenarios. There is a DataPower training in the market. How that will be available in terms of the market trending in terms of the DataPower or compared to other technologies. So the most of the industries which DataPower opt for, banking and finance, where the different number of consumers are available and they need very high throughput, and the SLA for the transaction should be very less and latency should be very less. So DataPower has that feasibility. So here it comes, the appliance will handle all the network traffic in a wire speed and can balance the load and can perform the transactions within a kind of milliseconds. So in a banking and finance domain, which is one of the most popular product in terms of the security, whereas the healthcare domains also go with this DataPower product in terms of integrating with different applications, and even in the network layer, if they are expecting some security to be performed before routing the request to the internal organizations, they're gonna go with the DataPower product. And telecommunications and retail also, in some scenarios, they're going to use based on the criticality of their domains. And it has very rapidly expand the scope of assets to allows customer to access critical resources. So mainly it's available to access a critical resources in terms of a banking and in terms of a healthcare domains to provide a high level of security and the high level of network availability. And it's a multi-tenant, multi-channel gateway that helps provide security, and it controls integration and optimized access to full range of mobile and web and workloads. So there is no separate components to be created because it's on a SOA architecture and it's on a ESB layer. So for any mobile-based applications or web-based applications, gateway will be one. So this gateway can take care of all those different number of consumers in terms of different systems. Though different number of APIs getting introduced in terms of the new components, that will be accommodated in terms of the DataPower. So if you are expecting any certifications in terms of the DataPower, this is the latest version which is available with IBM, like IBM DataPower Gateway version 7.6 solution implementation. This certification is for a development. And here we have the link where you can find all the resources with respect to the DataPower certification from the IBM's portal and their policy confirmations. And MindMajix will share you the certification from the MindMajix team on the course which you are enrolled for that. So these are some random topics which I wanna pick from DataPower in terms of the DataPower development. So for any development activities, mostly we're gonna cover 90% of the scenarios go with XML firewall or a multi-protocol gateway or a web service proxy. So all these things, including transformation of your messages and routing your data from component to component and backend system to the different number of downstream applications. And if we do the encryption, like message level security, we can perform in terms of the JSON web securities and the SOAP web securities and XML encryption and decryptions. Also, we'll be performing signing and validating your messages. If consumers is signing the message, DataPower will validate, and if DataPower signs the message, the service provider or a different consumer is going to validate it message. Also, we'll be talking about a secure socket layer communication, how it will happen in terms of a DataPower as a server and DataPower as a client. And we cover a AAA authentication, authorization, and auditing in terms of different consumers before allowing them to access different resources. And logging, we're going to see while creating log targets. And exception handling, we're going to implementing a global exception handling and a customized exception handling in terms of different scenarios. So we're going to learn about different troubleshooting mechanisms. So there are a few different troubleshooting mechanisms in terms of data for service levels. So we're going to learn those tips and tricks to troubleshoot an issue and to understand the data for logging mechanisms. So data for logs are something different, not like a general practice errors we see. So we're going to understand how the latency logs are looks like, and what is the root cause for the issue. By looking at the logs, we're going to learn about them. So also we're going to cover XSLT and gateway script components and the deployments starting from lower environment to higher environment, which includes different automation concepts and the deployment policies which are required in terms of migrating to the systems. And so there are a couple of major projects which we are discussing, which we'll be discussing as part of the training practically, and we'll be demonstrating on these projects, like performing a dynamic routing and transformation with XSLT and gateway script. So there will be different number of consumers triggering the request to DataPower, and DataPower has to make a decision to what backend downstream application DataPower has to route. So, and that part we'll be implementing with help of DataPower components and also in terms of the XSLT configuration and the gateway script configuration. And there is a project too which we talk about SSL. So this is one of the most important concept in terms of the DataPower development practices. And whereas DataPower acts as SSL server and DataPower acts as a SSL client, so what are the components involved in that, and how the consumer and service providers communicating to the DataPower appliance? It may be a physical or virtual. How the certificate exchange or a crypto certificates or a key values getting exchanged between the DataPower to the service consumer and provider. We'll see all this information in this scenario. And there is another one, implementing AAA component in business use case. Like if you are expecting some routing and transformation to be performed in the DataPower, so it's not a plain routing or transformation, but definitely the consumer has to get authenticated and authorized against the DataPower layer, ESB layer. So that authentication authorization we're gonna apply using a third-party authentication server called LDAP, which is a lightweight directory access protocol, which is for user authentication. So lakhs and millions of users were onboarded in the LDAP, and DataPower will integrate with LDAP and get the resource identities. So we'll see that scenario as part of project 3. So along these are the main components actually we were talking about projects. So there are a lot many in terms of SAML signatures, in terms of encryption, decryption, and in terms of different reusable components and exception handlings, loggings. So we'll be including all those things in these major projects. So in terms of a training lab setup, so as part of the training, we go with a virtual appliance. It may be on a Docker or it may be on a virtual appliance. So as part of our training, we're gonna use the VMware Workstation Player 16th version. So on top of this VMware player, we're gonna import our DataPower OVA file. So the OVA file should be required. So to make sure this systems is available, and the system requirements is 8 GB of RAM and i5 processor is mandatory. So because the VMware player will consume around 4 GB of your RAM, at least 6 GB of RAM is minimum. And so this is a different resources available for DataPower training along with the concepts which we're going to cover. So this is IBM's centralized product, centralized website where it contains different information about DataPower gateways in terms of development and in terms of administration. So from here you can redirect to different IBM communities and you can research your queries or post your questions out there. So I just mentioned a couple of DataPower interview questions. So definitely we're gonna expect these things to be aware when we are completed with our interviews. So these are the main concepts in terms of any enterprise is expecting. So what's the role of DataPower we are supposed to do, or what are the role of DataPower so far we were implemented any business logics in terms of DataPower, and the major component is multi-protocol gateway and WSPs in terms of data pod development. So definitely we have to understand the differences between those two components. So if I set data pod acts as a gateway, definitely it will the gateway will route my request to different downstream applications. So there is different routing mechanisms. I cannot say one routing mechanism. There is a multiple routings. So we're gonna learn how based on the requirement, consumer's requirement on the business logic, we're gonna choose any one of the routing mechanism. So along with dynamic routing with transformations, so like transforming from one format to another format, where the backend system understands one format, consumer gonna sense a different format. Datapower acts as a middleware layer where it can converts the data from format to format. So in terms of the consumers and providers. So also definitely we got a question on SSL and AAA because it's a major security components in terms of the Datapower security features. So these are the things which were covering and part of the training. So if you have any questions in terms of the data for course content in terms of development and administration, you can reach out to the mentioned email ID here. So MindMajix team will help you on all of your queries. Thank you.